listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I'm joined today by my good friend, Todd Cochrane. He is the CEO of Blueberry. Todd, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Heather. And it's going to be good to catch up.
Yeah, for sure. So, Todd, I feel like I've been in this space for a long time, but you've been in this space for a long time. How many years have you been in the podcast industry?
About 2 weeks, it'll be 19 years, which is insane.
Wow, congratulations. That's
Yeah.
so awesome. I feel like talking to you is like getting such a great overview of where we've come and where we're going. And I was curious, just to kind of start us off, what would you say are some of the things that you have really seen change in the podcast advertising space in general? Are there any elements that really stand out to you where you're like, hey, this is how we did it for years and now this is how we do it?
Well, it's very obvious to me that the programmatic piece is really kind of exploded. The programmatic piece has just, went off the chart, and it's made opportunities for shows that probably would not get advertising through, host endorsed type of advertising. So that opportunity is available now. Almost any podcast host, not just us. It's just now almost to the point where they can flip a switch. But that
Mm-hmm.
said, at the same time, there has to have these realistic expectations with what comes with that, because obviously the CPMs are not as high as they would be from a host endorsed standpoint. But I'm finding that what it's doing and what it's allowing content creators to realize is when they get that first check, it's something, and it might be take their partner to dinner money, or it could be car payment money. It really depends on the size of the show, but it gives this realization that, I'm getting some value back for the content that I'm putting forward. And it gives them that bridge. And I actually stole that term from Tom Webster. It gives them that bridge to get to the point where they grow their show, where they can go into those bigger host endorsed type ads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the great thing about programmatic is not only is it a nice resource for the content creator, but it's also a nice resource for the advertiser, right? I feel like when I got in this space 7 years ago, it was like, there really weren't a lot of great programmatic options, and it just feels like they're getting better, year after year. I still don't think they're fully perfected, especially from an advertiser perspective. But I think that the fact that we have it now in a larger capacity, and like you said, most podcasters can tap into some level of programmatic ads. I think that for me, that is like creating that full circle that really didn't exist in the podcast space for a long time.
And we've been doing some audits on the type of ads that are running on what type of shows they're running on.
Hmm.
And obviously they're IP targeted, because they, oftentimes they want to run maybe a public service announcement for something going on in a specific region or city. And the ads, in my opinion, are not remnant. They're pretty high. It's stuff that you would not be surprised to hear.
Mhm.
And I think that's the exciting part. But one thing that's interesting too about at least our experience, and SoundStack is our partner at Blueberry that does our fulfillment for programmatic, is that the longer a content creator is on programmatic, the higher the CPMs get and the higher the fill rates. In the early days of a podcaster turning the switch on, it starts and it builds, but we're seeing now where we're getting about 80 to 85% fill rates on each episode, which, is pretty awesome,
Mhm.
because sometimes we don't get 85% fill rates on host read.
Oh,
So
sure.
so I'm pretty excited about that. And we've made it available now where folks can do pre-roll and mid if they
Mhm.
want. And I think podcasters are more comfortable with the pre-roll than making sure they have the spot for the mid-roll. And then it's surprising we still see some stuff post-roll too. But
Mhm.
between you and me, what's the real value in that? I don't think that much.
I used to be so anti post roll. And I still don't think it's a great spot, but I was listening to a show the other day when I was working. I was working on a project in the house and I just listened to several episodes back to back and I kept getting the post roll and kept getting the post roll and I wasn't going to stop, like I was just working, right? And
Yep.
I was
Yep.
like, I sometimes think maybe we undersell the value of the post roll. Maybe there is more listenership to it than we realize, but yeah, I mean, I definitely get your point. What kind of CPMs are you looking at? Any idea what kind of range these programmatic ads are falling in?
And it's again, it's kind of interesting when a podcaster first starts, at least switches on with us. This is what we're seeing. It's lower. It's $6, $7.
Hmm.
But then again, the longer they're on, month two, we start to see it increase. It's almost like the machine is learning that, okay, here's the consistency, here's the repetitiveness, here's what I'm expecting this can deliver. So there's like some logic being learned, and then the CPM start going
Hmm.
up. But I don't think I've seen anything higher than maybe 13, 13 and a
Mm.
half. That would be about as high as I've
Hmm.
seen it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now the goal, I'd like to see it get, the real sweet spot would be at 15. That's what I think where it would be fantastic, but I
Hmm.
don't know if I ever get to 15.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And Tom, before we get too deep into our conversation, if somebody's listening and they don't have any idea what Blueberry is, tell us a little bit about what you guys do.
Yeah, Blueberry is a full service podcast company. Hosting's a piece of that, but hosting's almost commoditized today. So, we really are focused on the features and tools that we provide content creators that host with us. We're very much involved in the new Podcasting 2.0 initiative. If you don't know about anything about that, happy to come over and take a look on the website and just search for Podcasting 2.0 and get educated on the expansion of RSS. But again, we're full service. We have everything from DAI that you manage yourself to programmatic to great stats, of course. We've spent probably the last 6 months really beefing up the stats. And it's caused us actually to start migrating a lot of shows off other platforms that don't have as capable statistics.
Mm.
Media kits, just we got the full line of everything a podcaster would need. And the main thing is we just provide the tools and services and then just get out of the way and let you build your brand. Our PowerPress plugin is very, very popular and allows someone that has a WordPress site to basically power their podcast on their own website.
Mhm, mhm. That's awesome. And you're one of the original companies, right? I mean, weren't you in kind of the first wave of hosting companies to start in the podcast space?
Yeah, we were, but initially the podcast, we actually started as a media company to believe it or not. At the
Huh.
at the very beginning, we did pure advertising for about 5 years before we switched to the service side. And there's a whole story about why that happened. But most of the advertising stuff we work with partners on.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so I'm curious as we look across the landscape, there is so much that has changed, and I think that it's changing for the better in many ways. What do you think that we're still missing from an advertising perspective that either an advertiser could really use or maybe a podcaster could really use?
I think it's about the copy. And
Hmm, yeah.
I think we have to understand this is, I think some media buyers still consider this almost radio, and it's
Yes.
not. And I think the quality of the ad copy, if we would just spend an extra 30 minutes, and that doesn't take that much, an extra 30 minutes on the ad copy and on the talking points, I think the campaigns would come across better. But as I listen to 100 new shows every 2 weeks, and sometimes,
Wow, that's a
yeah,
lot.
and I have a whole years and years and years of data, and I've listened to a lot of ads, and from show to show to show, sometimes the ads are just cookie cutter
Mm.
and they're reading the same copy and it's the same. And I understand there's only, let's say let's just use some food service business, we'll leave it at that. The ads are too, bring them personalized.
Mhm.
And I think also, if you're going to have a long time host read endorsement, you better be using that product. You better really know what that product tastes like or what that product does or how the deliveries happen and or whatever that function of that. You need to know that. And maybe the vendor's not going to give it to you. Maybe you should subscribe yourself
Hmm.
just to get a better handle, because then you can personalize the copy and it just makes it more personable. So I know some podcasters do that, but a lot don't. And then and be honest with you, and it's a word people are not going to like, but don't be lazy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think it makes such a huge difference when we're talking about results when the host that's doing the ad read actually knows the product, understands the product. So I guess one of the things that I was wanting to talk to you about, so you've led me right into it, which is great. How should we be thinking about advertising in the context of content, right? Because as you said, nobody wants podcasting to become radio. And
Right.
I don't listen to terrestrial radio very often, but when I do, I'm always shocked at the number of ads that there are, right? There's so many ads, and so often they don't feel very related. I mean, I think that despite the fact that maybe we don't necessarily all want to be watched as we peruse the internet, it is nice to see ads for products that you're interested in buying.
Yeah.
And in podcasting, while there isn't quite that level of sophistication used frequently, there is still so much thought that goes into the campaigns, right? And I would say, even if we're talking about programmatic or host read, the reality is that the buyer has really looked at this audience and said, hey, this is an audience that I would like. So from a listener perspective, or even from an advertiser perspective, what should that expectation be around the difference between the ad and the content, and how should we be approaching that?
Well, number one, don't have such a heavy ad load that you annoy me. And again, this doesn't happen to all shows, but some of the ad load on some podcasts now are like 6.5 minutes, and bam, you're into another ad. And it drives me insane. I unsubscribe for those shows. So I think as a content creator, you have to really think about the ad load. Don't get pushed into too much.
Hmm.
But at the same point, I look at my own historical relationship with GoDaddy. I do a tech show, so GoDaddy fits on the tech show. It's a good medium. It's a good transition. It's a great way to get my customers to be engaged, because they're kind of geeks and nerds. But sometimes ads come through that aren't an exact match, so there has to be something that we do as hosts to make them relatable. But again, we all have, let's say that demographic that advertisers trying to meet is, let's say it's women with children, married or not. And, then if that's the target audience, then the advertiser needs to make sure that it's clear to the content creator who we are supposed to address.
Hmm.
If they, because the audiences are very vast, and if that advertiser says, okay, my key demographic for this product is 25 to 45, again, women with children, single or married, then you could start the ad out. You don't have to be totally annoying, but hey, ladies, I think I got a great product for you. And you get their attention. I think you have to almost, as the content creator, have to address that specific audience a little more directly. Don't leave the
Hmm.
rest of the audience behind. But at the same time, the advertiser has to also realize that while they're trying to reach a specific demographic, probably 50% audience is outside of the boundary of what they're looking for. So they need to understand that from a performance standpoint, maybe even that, let's say that show's getting 10,000 listens an episode, maybe you're really only reaching that audience, maybe 5K of that specific audience that is the actual audience that is the supposed demographic. So I think advertisers have to take that into consideration. Now, do podcasters, are they doing the work to figure out, number one, who my audience really, really is? I think that's another part of the component as well, is we think we know who our audience is, but maybe you need to do a survey every year to say, hey, tell me who you really are.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. You are famous for talking about your relationship with GoDaddy, and you've had them as an advertiser for over 10 years, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, 18 years. June will
18
be,
years. Wow.
yeah,
So, one of the things that I always find really fascinating is that a lot of advertisers feel like there's a level of diminishing returns with a
yeah,
podcast, right? They're like, well, we got in there, we advertised, it worked well for 6 months, maybe it worked well for a year. Now we're just not seeing the returns in the way that maybe we want to see them. But here you are, as you said, you've got a tech show and you've had them as an advertiser for going on 18 years now, and they're still coming back year after year, and they are looking for direct response. They're not,
right, right.
they're counting what kind of business they're getting from your show.
That's
how
right.
how do you keep the ad reads fresh in a way to make your audience actually want to pay attention? And I feel like, to be honest, GoDaddy's almost even harder in my opinion as a business owner, because I'm like, yeah, I know GoDaddy exists. Like, it's not a new thing for me. It's not really exciting. Of course, I have my perception of what GoDaddy is.
Sure.
Maybe there are new products that they're offering that I'm totally unaware of. But it's a well-established brand. They already have really good market penetration. How are you keeping that fresh for your audience?
The ad copy, to be kind of honest, the ad copy doesn't get really that diversified. The goal or the reason for success, and this is unique to maybe my show because I knew what I had to do. I have to have new listeners coming in. I have to have I'm addressing the new audience every episode. The
Interesting.
it's the 10, 15, 30, 50 new listeners that I'm addressing that haven't heard the ad 200 times, because
Right.
it's the new listeners. And so I have a number I have to hit every month. So it's again, a lot of the success with this continues to be about the long consistency of the show. So the what we have seen, and because I've been doing this so long, is people do get sick of listening to our voices, and
I
and they
know.
leave.
What? How is that possible, Todd?
They leave. They stay around for a couple of years and then they leave, and then
Yes.
surprisingly, after a year or two,
They might come
uh,
back.
they come back,
Mhm,
and they say, "Well, you're still here," and but yet they're like, "Well, I've heard GoDaddy already." But again, it's the brand new first time
mhm,
listeners that I'm really going after. At the same time, and this is not a secret, there's a landing page on my website that is dedicated to GoDaddy and the sponsorship. So there is a certain amount of traffic that comes there natively from
mhm,
Google. So I will get some credit for non-podcast listening conversions, which again, they are DR. They ultimately say, and I only get credit on new customers. I don't get
mhm,
credit on renewals.
mhm,
So it is unique, but I think if you apply that to a HelloFresh or whoever's currently the hot advertiser, I think that if you're going to do that for multiple months, let's say they come in month one and they do buy 2 spots for a month, and month two they buy whatever the load might be. I think you really, really need to think about, okay, the existing audience has maybe heard this spot two, three, 4 times. So this is where, as a content creator, you have to have those new ears or eyeballs, whatever way
mhm,
you want to look at it, coming into your show. And then I think what that ultimately means is maybe you need to set the expectations correctly with the media buyer to say, okay, if this is DR, what is the goal?
mhm,
And sadly, you know, they won't tell you that it's DR, but they back the numbers out based upon how many new customers they've got. If it has a direct buy type of
mhm,
situation, but then you also have to get more creative on your lift. If you're doing a lift study for them, you're coming back and say, okay, this month we gained X number of new listeners that came in. They grew the show by 2, 3, 4%. Those are something that you should put in your report for unique to let them know that, these are new people that were exposed. So I don't know if it works in all cases, but
mhm,
it's something to think about.
mhm. Do you send GoDaddy a report every month? I mean, because they have all the data on their end. Are you sending them your own report every month?
I don't have to send them nothing. They
Okay.
and here's what it works. You were above or you were below.
Hmm.
And if it's below for more than a couple of months, we have a call, we do a talk, we talk about the product, the offerings, what we think
Hmm.
we need to spice things up. And luckily, the below doesn't happen very often. And so, it's one of those situations where I knock on wood every week when the report comes in, and it's either thumbs up or thumbs down. And it really isn't kind of played out that way in the email, but it
Sure.
just, I get the report.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but GoDaddy also knows, even though I don't get credit for the renewals, they know that I have brought literally probably close to 1 million new customers to them, that those renewals do count and those listeners
Hmm.
still listen. And if they quit advertising, it might affect renewals. It may not.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So, one of the things that I think most podcasters struggle with is audience growth. And what you're saying, which I think is really fascinating, is the results for an advertising campaign can often come from new audience growth, right? It's
Yeah.
being able to bring in a new listener, expose them to a new product that maybe, they were unfamiliar with, or the product just wasn't top of mind. Now, when we look at the landscape in the industry, there are, I think, about 4 million podcasts now. And I know when I started in 2016, there were 400,000 podcasts at that time. So I always look at that growth and I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. And I could see how it would be much harder to build an audience today than it was, 5 years ago. However, I know when you and I were talking, you mentioned that really there aren't as many podcasters out there actively producing episodes. And I always want to kind of shout that from the rooftop a little bit, right? It's like, just because there are 4 million podcasts out there, that could have been like a couple of friends getting together one night, jumping on a free, hosting platform and saying, we're going to do 2 episodes or even 1 episode, right? And
Yeah.
now it's there, but it's not really super active. How many podcasts are there that are actively producing new episodes right now?
This is easy to find. You can go over to podcastindex.org, and I'm reading right from their webpage right now. In the last 10 days, 241,000 shows have produced a new episode. In the last 30 days, 338,000 have produced an episode. And in the last 60, 408,000 shows have produced a new episode. Now, you divide that across 30 plus categories, and you can start to see here that the competitive landscape is not as big as people think it is.
Hmm.
While at the same time, a year ago, the 10-day average would have been over 400,000. So what we've seen is, because I think of the economy and because, budgets are tighter, I think we've seen a lot of shows stop production. So, but that doesn't mean these, if we look at the Nielsen numbers and stuff that's come out of Sounds Profitable, the the number of listeners continue to grow. So we're seeing significant growth on across the board, because these listening audiences are seeking out shows now, because the show maybe they were listening to before is gone. So
Hmm.
they're still listening to the same amount of content, but they're seeking out new. So this impression you have to make in the first 2 minutes of your episode is critical. You got to get in there and get them hooked. You got to, if you're fishing, you got to lock them in, right? And so I think that the opportunity now for podcasters is unique. And people kind of scoff when I say this. This is the best time I have seen in many, many years to be a podcaster. This is a great time to build audience and do that growth piece, but you just can't create good content. There's a whole host of things that you have to do to engage. But again, I think, and then maybe this isn't completely on topic of what you asked me, but podcasters need to ask their audience to ask their friends to listen to the show. It's still the number one way shows grow. So it's an interesting time for sure. But again, I think that anyone that is wanting to build a successful podcast, it's work. And building, even today for me, getting those new listeners in, I spend a considerable budget hiring people to make sure I have fresh content on my website. It's relevant. It's getting found by, the Googles of the world. People are coming in, and then a small percentage of those that land on my website click follow on the show and listen. And again, it's purely a numbers game. And again, you got to be doing the 10 or 15 different things you have to do to build a show, and it's work. And they're not creating content is not enough. It's just not
Right.
enough.
Right, right. I think, though, that as you mentioned, I do get the feeling often that content creators kind of feel like that ship has sailed, right? That, like, oh, everybody's got a podcast. And I think it's so hilarious, when you see on TV shows or in articles or whatever, like when people just say, like, they joke about, like, oh, you need to start a podcast about that, or everybody's got a podcast. Where's your podcast? The reality is that I like to compare it often to blogs, right? And there are 600 million blogs out there.
That's right.
And if there are 600 million blogs, then we can have way more than 4 million podcasts. And we can definitely succeed if we're only seeing, like, maybe on average about 300,000 of those podcasts creating new content each month. And when you look at the intersection between content creation and software development, I think now is one of the best times to be a podcaster because everything is coming together, right? They're all like we talked about at the very beginning of the conversation. Now it is so much easier for podcasters to tap into ad dollars. And on the flip side, so much easier for advertisers to tap into those shows and those audiences. I think the scalability of podcasts is kind of getting to that almost critical mass place where I do think we're going to have a tipping point here at some point, I would think within the next few years, if not sooner than that. So it really is a great time to be in the podcasting business. And it's a great time to be advertising the podcast business. Wouldn't you agree?
And I think I'm also seeing a crack that I've been waiting to see develop for
Mm,
literally years. We're starting finally to see where smaller shows, and again, again, depends on the show and the topic, where smaller shows that are maybe sub 5,000 listeners per episode are starting now, after many, 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 many years, to finally be understood to be a good bet by an
mhm,
advertiser because of the relationship that content creator has with that audience. It's tighter, usually resulting in higher performance than bigger shows. And some advertisers are starting to actually go down in the stack a little deeper and starting to pick up some shows. Now, is it going to make that person a lot of money? Well, the traditional CPM, it's going to make you some money, but it's a simple math equation.
mhm, mhm,
CPM times whatever that number per thousand is.
mhm,
And, but I think it's an opportunity also for those creators to, those smaller shows, to think about those niche advertisers that may pay a premium as well for the content. And for the advertisers that are listening, really, in my opinion, you've missed the boat for the last more than 10 years,
mhm.
and not recognizing that smaller shows have this high value. At the same time, you're killing me. I listen. I did the ad count on a top, I'll say top 50 podcast, and there was 4 pre-rolls, and in an hour and 10-minute show, there was an ad or two every 6.5 minutes. I quit when I got to like count 12 on
Wow.
the ad. And the ad reads were horrible. I mean, horrible. You could tell the host did not care. Blah blah
Right.
blah 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 blah, and they were done. I think advertisers are just flushing money down the toilet with,
Mhm,
frankly, that type of ad load.
mhm.
So I don't know. I think it's bad strategy. Are you seeing, on your end? What are you seeing demands for ad load on shows, and what are shows taking?
I think it's so interesting because we really coach our podcasters to try and keep their ad load down. Oftentimes, content creators want to maximize the revenue that they can receive. And I get that. Like, yeah, of course, they want to get a paycheck. But ultimately, you do have to think about two really important pieces. One is your listener. And as you said, when you overfill your podcast with ads, it drives away listeners. CPMs. The
Yep.
other thing that podcasters do that we fight them on tooth and nail is they like to stack all their ads back to back. It's like, let's not stack them all together. Let's spread them
Right.
out a bit, right? And, really, I advise people, if you're going to do a 30 to 60-minute show, you should have no more than 4 ads, right?
I agree.
Maybe a pre-roll, maybe a few posts or a few mid-rolls. And if you get a little longer, right? Like if you're getting into the hour and a half, like, yeah, maybe you could do more. Maybe you could do 2 ad breaks and do 2 mid-rolls and ad breaks. So you could do 4 mid-rolls and 1 pre-roll. As we've discussed, like you could do post rolls, but we don't typically sell a lot of them. But it's, you just have to be really conscientious about your audience. And then on the flip side, you have to be conscientious about your advertiser, right? The advertisers are coming because they're looking to have an impact on your audience,
Hmm.
regardless of if they're DR agencies or brand advertisers. They want to see their KPIs being met. And
That's
when
right.
you overload a podcast with ad reads, no one is accomplishing their goals. Now, what I recommend that people do is let's keep your ad load smaller. And when we get you sold out, suddenly let's raise those CPMs, right? So
There you
now we
go.
can say, hey, like, oh, this show is filled all the time. And we have those shows on our roster at True Native where it's like, this show's full all the time. So we're going to charge you a $45 CPM just because obviously it's working for the advertisers. That's why we've got it full, and we can keep the ad load down and we can charge a higher price. So
Yep.
that's really where the money should be made, is in that piece, in my opinion.
And I think also as having now almost 1,700 episodes on my primary show, you learn. I can look at the stats. I used to go into them like daily. I used to be a stats junkie, and I can be honest with you, I can't tell you the last time I looked at my personal show stats, but I knew that in at least the period where I was doing multiple host reads,
Mm-hmm.
that I knew that two for that show was great. And when I hit three, the annoyance emails started coming, and the numbers, you could see the stats drop off a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
for my show, the sweet spot was two, and at about a 60-minute show. Every
Mm-hmm.
show's different,
Mm-hmm.
but also my host reads were not 30 seconds,
Right.
so that was part of it too. Now, if I had stuck to the hard and give them the 30 or 60 and nothing more, I'd probably have been okay with three, but
Yeah.
I talk too much. So, I would give them a 90
Right.
and 2 90s. And that's why they would get annoyed, is
Yeah.
because the ad reads were too long.
Yeah.
So,
So now I was going to ask, Rob over at Libsyn used to, and maybe he still does, and I just haven't heard him speak in a while. He used to always show a slide in his presentation where he would give the breakdown of, if you have more than 5,000 downloads, then that means you're in the top 1%
right.
of podcasts. I feel like we've been talking a lot more recently about, there's been, I feel like, articles that have said if you buy the top 100 podcasts, you're going to reach 90% of the podcast listeners or whatever. I had Ellie on from Acast a few episodes ago, and her and I kind of dove into that, and really, like, they found that is not at all true.
I don't
I
believe it.
I don't believe it either. But I guess I'm curious, do you have any knowledge of the sizes, and because I feel like people ask me that all the time, like, well, if I have this many downloads, like, where do I fall in the podcast ranking? And I always tell people, gosh, if you're getting more than 1,000 to 5,000 downloads per episode, now that's an important piece, right? It has to be per
Yep.
episode. It can't be
Yep.
cumulative. Then, I mean, you really are in like the top 5% of podcasts that exist, is what I tell people. But it's been a while since I've seen those stats.
We have a different audience than Libsyn, be honest with you, at least from a creator standpoint.
Sure.
So we've been very lucky in that my type of slide that Rob would show, the numbers are much higher from an average standpoint. And the reason for that is because a very high majority of our customers already have a brand, a .com. They have their own website. They are vested in making sure traffic gets to that website. And so naturally, those types of creators already sometimes have pre-built audiences because
Sure.
they've already got funnels and newsletters and stuff like that. So, not to say anyone can't build this, and this is why, I've been on the bandwagon for 20 years almost now, saying have your own brand, have your own .com, right? And I think that if you are above 1,000 listens and downloads per episode, you are doing well. I wouldn't say you're in the top 5%. You're probably in the top 10%.
Hmm.
But then again, it increments up once you get to
Sure.
5 and 10. If you get to 10,000, you're definitely in the top 5% of shows for sure.
Mm.
But again, it's not saying that you can't make good money with a smaller audience. It all
Sure.
depends on what type of content you're creating too.
Yeah.
The wider, you've had this discussion, I'm sure, many times. The wider you are, the more numbers you have to have. The narrower you are with a specific topic, the smaller you of the numbers have to be to make good money. My show, I be honest with you, and I hate to keep going back and talking about my old show because I'm an old dog, right? I've been in this a long time. But again, I have to build audience numbers every month to make my
Hmm.
advertiser happy. And I think if you are focused as much on the advertising as you are building your show, those two will align and you'll find success. And I don't like when people say, "Oh, I'm having a hard time building my show." And then usually I can get into their website and within 5 minutes, I can probably point out 5 things that they need to do. And one of those is if I can't follow or subscribe to your show when I land on your website right from above the fold, you've already lost.
Hmm. Hmm.
And 97% of people will never scroll down further.
Right. Right.
And so it's just little things, podcast
Hmm.
101 things people can do to build their shows. So when people say, I can't build an audience, I'm say, okay, what are you doing and who are you listening to?
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's really great advice. So I'm curious, I would love to get into the discussion about ad tech. So one of the things that I talk about, and I'm just really curious what your reaction is to this, is that in the podcast space, we are heavily reliant on hosting companies to provide ad tech. And it's not like that in other industries, right? It's, like you're not looking to your GoDaddy or your HostGator to be your ad server,
Right,
on
right.
your website. And one of the things that I struggle with is that I don't feel oftentimes that hosting companies really care about the ad tech piece because they're there to serve the content creator, right? So they're like, how can we provide, and as you mentioned, hosting has become much more commoditized, right? So okay, we've got the basics that you're going to be able to host your show, but what are the other tools? Can we give you the demographic information? Can we help you monetize it? Can we help you with audience growth? Can we help you with your website? Those are like all of those different elements play into it. But I don't know that hosting providers do a very good job about thinking about what the advertiser wants from that hosting tool to be an ad service provider, right? And we've got great companies out there, like you mentioned, SoundStack, where they really are more of an ad tech company, right? They
Right,
do
right.
the hosting, but their core business is more ad tech. And you've
Yeah.
obviously partnered with them to help provide that service. But I guess I'm just curious, especially, as we kind of look into the podcast 2.0, ecosphere and what you guys are trying to accomplish with that. Where do you see ad tech playing in the role of the hosting company?
I think what we've tried to do is provide the tools the podcaster needs, whatever their monetization model is.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, and this is just some simple stuff, the ability for the podcaster to assign a sub account to maybe their buyer so that they can come in and just do a quick
Mm-hmm.
look and
Mm-hmm.
look at the stats. Number two, for those that are more sophisticated, we have an API. So basically, the podcaster can authorize through a token the ability of their ad partner to pull their data directly into their own system and then make the charts that they want on their own. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a second piece. The third piece is because the content creator sometimes may have to put pixel tracking or something like that, we make it easy for them to be able to put whatever they need on their website or on their page or within the redirect prepend, whatever it needs to be for them to be able to participate in a campaign with any provider, a company like yours or whoever. I think the question I would have for you is, what would you want from us that would help you?
Hmm.
And if you tell us and give us that short list or whatever it may be, then that's something I can add to the dev stack to say, okay, hey, True Native Media needs these pieces when they work with our podcasters for advertising deals. That to me gives me the value to go back and say, hey, as a hosting provider, we work with whoever you work with, and we'll make sure they get the data they need from that standpoint. I think stats are probably the biggest sticking point. And,
Hmm.
I think because we are IAB certified, just like almost everyone now,
Hmm.
we are in the business of a little bit. I have a different perspective on stats. I overqualify even for IAB standards. Because I can't say what's happened in the IB meeting, but I will say that some people are having some challenges with some counting because of a certain action that happens with Apple Podcasts. Well, I've never had that issue because I overqualify downloads.
Hmm.
And because my motto is I don't care what the number is, as long as I know what the number is. Because when you sell, you say, okay, we're going to guarantee 5,000 plays per episode for this show for the next, whatever time period. You're counting on those deliveries,
Hmm.
and you want those to be real and no overcounting, and so that the media buyer gets the best, they get their money's worth.
Right.
And to me, that's what keeps the media buyers coming back. They get their money's worth. They
Hmm.
know a show works or it doesn't because they're tracking. They have
Hmm.
every show on their list. They've got it in a spreadsheet. They're looking at performance. And if a show's off on performance and it's off because the 5 shows from a single host are off in performance, the media buyer is going to say, hey, I have to discount them because they're counting wrong or whatever it may be.
Right.
They're not dumb. They're smart on this. So I think our job is really to make sure that you get the right numbers so that you can represent the show correctly. But
Hmm.
what is
Hmm.
something I can do for you, Heather? What do you need that we're not providing?
Well, so there's two pieces that I really feel like are big elements in the podcast space right now that I don't think are being talked about often enough. So the first one is a forecasting tool. Now, I
Mm,
know that there are some hosting platforms that do provide a forecasting tool, but essentially when it comes to dynamic ad insertion, we have to predict how many impressions we think a campaign can get. So
right.
when we're looking at a podcast gets a certain number of downloads across their full catalog within a 30-day period, right? So we could say this show's getting 100,000 downloads on average in a 30-day period across their full catalog. So that would mean that we should be able to sell about 25,000 impressions in a week period, right? Or if we're going to sell the full month, 100. Well, that doesn't really happen, right? Because typically that listener is only being counted, right? If they are listening to that part of the episode where the ad appears. So it would be really great if we could say this campaign is going to run, and the hardest part is when they don't run standard, right? Like this campaign is going to run from Wednesday, December 6th through, you know, Thursday, December 21st, right? And so we're picking these date ranges, and the advertiser usually picks them because they have some specific promotion or something going on that they want that date range. And it would be so nice to be able to say, okay, I'm going to look back historically at this podcast. I'm going to look at what they usually do based on their release dates, based
Mhm.
on the average listener count. I'm going to say that I could predictively give you this number that if we ran this campaign, you should get 33,000 impressions based on, like I said, the release schedule of episodes, the average kind of listen through rate, the ebbs and flows of, oh, Tuesdays tend to have more listeners than Thursdays or whatever. Like if
Yep,
we were
yep.
able to calculate all of that, I feel like that would be phenomenal.
Is that on
The
back catalog or just new episodes or both?
both. Yeah. Um
I'm writing this into my spreadsheet right now.
And then the other thing that is being requested so much more, like even just in the last like 3 to 6 months, is frequency capping on campaigns. And
Oh,
none of us wants to hear the same ad 20 times, right?
right.
Like That's just not a fun experience. It's not good for the advertiser. It's not good for the listener. The problem with frequency capping is there are hosting platforms out there that allow for frequency capping. I'm not a computer programmer. I do not know how they've created this. But it appears as though the actual technology behind what it looks like to frequency cap is not really there, again, in any sort of predictive capacity, right? So an agency can come to us and say, we want to run this campaign and we want a 4 frequency cap for the month, meaning that the same person isn't going to hear the ad more than 4 times. And it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
great. But let's look at the audience. Like, then we have to look at the audience. We have to look
Right.
at like how many of your audience members listen to 1 episode a month? How is that
Right.
affecting frequency capping?
Right.
What
Right.
about the people who are listening to 5 episodes a month or 6 episodes? Or, there's just all of these factors that actually come into play. And we're working on a report and a study that we're going to be publishing at True Native about frequency capping that I'm excited to release hopefully in the next few weeks. But it's a very important piece, especially when we're talking about programmatic and especially when we're talking about doing host read ads that are dynamically inserted, which right now is the majority of the industry is doing dynamically inserted host read ads. So
Yeah.
that frequency cap is really important. So,
Frequency capping, first of all, I hate it personally, because I think the advertiser's short-sighted in their approach, because if you've got good ad copy that is progressive ad copy, then frequency capping is not an issue. It builds the story and makes people want to do stuff more. But I understand where they're coming from.
I
Um,
will also say, sorry to interrupt you, Todd, but I will also say the other piece that we have struggled with some of the hosting companies that we work with is I should be able to say, you know what, GoDaddy, I don't want to have 1 ad read for you this month because I know on average my audience listens to 4 episodes a month. I want to do 4 ad reads. So I'm going to rotate through the ad reads and
yep,
run them so that if I listen to, the CEO roundtable on Monday in the morning, I hear a different GoDaddy ad than if I listen to the CEO
that's right.
roundtable in the afternoon. It's not
Yep,
because part of it is that we just don't want to hear the exact same thing over and over, right? And
yeah,
so
and that
if we could rotate through ad reads,
I think that's critical. And if it's a multi-week or multi-month campaign, the ad copy has to change every week. It can't be the same.
right,
Has
right.
to,
It
has
has
to.
to, right? Or else
And if
that's where you get diminishing returns.
right, and if that show is doing 2 shows a week, you better have variations of copy every show. But
Mhm.
the frequency capping, and again, we've never looked at that, and thinking about it just hypothetically, it's all based on IP. But the problem is, it has to be. Well, there's a couple other things it could be, and again, then how deep do we want to dig into our listeners' privacy? But
Right?
let's just say it's purely IP tracking. Um, people's if the, and once IPv6 comes into full play, this is impossible. You get a new IPv6 address like every 10 minutes.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, so IPv6, where it's deployed outside the United States, that IPv6 is updating. It's not like stays with you permanently like it was designed. It like is like almost like a ticker counter. It changes all the time. IPv4 is a little more stable, maybe between your house and your job,
Hmm.
but if you're mobile, you go more than maybe 6 or 7 miles in your car and the IP changes. So depending on when that episode hits. So this IP frequency, if you're using IPs for frequency capping, uh, okay, it's going to be maybe a little effective. But again, maybe this goes back and where we have to tell the advertiser, I know you want to do frequency capping, but I think there's a better way and a
Hmm.
better way to get results, because we've all heard the same, let's say, for example, Geico ad 82 times on radio.
Hmm.
I don't need to hear the same ad. Let's hear fresh copy all the time and have some variance. And that's where the cost of the campaigns will go up, because you have to have more. Or let's just have a list of 25 talking points and tell the
Right.
podcaster, hit 4 different talking points every episode. Make sure you get the call to action in there and
Right.
go.
Right.
Um,
Well, and you could really be hitting the nail on the head because I do agree with you. I think frequency capping, I understand the intention behind it,
yeah,
and I'm not opposed to the intention that's behind it.
right.
What I believe is happening, which is what happens in the podcast space often, is the execution from a technology perspective is not there. And so if the execution from a technology standpoint isn't there, then we're not really living behind the true intent of the exercise. And so I do think as we've been discussing, it could quite possibly have more to do with rotation of ad copy as opposed to that frequency cap. Because we also know people need to hear about your product, 6 to 10 times before they make a buying
That's
decision.
right. That's right.
So, you
And
know,
if we go back to the forecasting tool, though, I've had that tool for years internally. So it's something that we could give to the podcaster, because all they really have to do is, well, a matter of fact, our podcasters could potentially use it today by setting a date range and looking at, previous history. But
mhm,
again, the where you throw the cog in the wheel here is that podcaster has to be consistent. They need to be, if they're putting an
true.
episode out every week, and if they're doing every week or every twice a week, whatever, as long as they've been consistent,
Mhm,
then the forecasting tool works well. But I think we'd have to build into the forecasting tool the ability to say, hey, it looks like your frequency is weekly on this data range. You're missing an episode
mhm,
and have to make an adjustment.
mhm.
I fully understand the need to be able to say you're going to deliver this much during this time. And if a podcaster's been going more than a couple of years, we should have good frequency data. But again, the show has grown, so you have to look at current data. And
Right.
the way I used to look at it heavily was I looked at the last 12 episodes
Mhm.
and I did
Yeah. Yep.
just a running
Yep.
average for
Yep.
the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And I got a number, and I use that
Mhm.
number, and then
Mhm.
you pray that you've set the number right in the RFP, and you come in a little above, you come a little below, you hope you're close, it all evens out across multiple shows. So yeah, I understand the game there, but at the same point, because advertisers are not running in every episode like they used to many years ago, they're running in two a month or whatever it may be, then maybe those two specific shows, you're right, the one that's released on Monday versus the one released on Thursday, that's a different variable. That could be 25%.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. And I feel like that plays into it too. And it's hard, like, if you have a daily show is very different than, one of our bigger shows that we work with releases 2 episodes a month. And that
right.
really throws things off a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Todd, this has been such a great conversation. And I know you and I could go on and on. But just to wrap us up, tell me, do you have any predictions as to where you feel like the podcast industry is headed?
Oh, the one thing is AI is going to be everywhere.
Mhm.
And we spent the last 4 months really heavily looking at AI stuff that is not going to be extinct in a year,
Right.
because we are currently using the stupidest AI we'll ever use.
Yep.
And it's pretty remarkable what's capable now. So, our strategy at Blueberry, and I'm sure every service, I don't know, it doesn't matter what company you're in. If you're not paying attention to AI, you better, or you may not have a job in a couple of years, or
Yeah.
business. Things are changing fast. So the AI piece is going to, it's going number one, it's going to help podcasters be better hosts. It's going to help them with their post production. It's going to help them with social. It's going to touch every aspect. So AI is really what's going to change the space the most. And I
Mhm.
think that podcasters that use the tools correctly have an opportunity to significantly advance their audience. Because guess what? When you're when you're the host, when you're the GM, when you're the social promotion, when you're a team of one, there's not much time you have to breathe and still live. And I think these AI tools are going to allow you to be a force multiplier and allow you to be, instead of one person, you'll be able to three. And maybe if you have a team that's listeners are supporting you, you turn them onto this, and all of a sudden, you look like you're a team of 10 when you're a team of two or one.
Mhm.
It's going to change things
Mhm.
globally. So
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Todd, thank you so much for being on the show
Yeah,
today. I
thank
really
you.
appreciate it. If people are looking for you, where can they find you?
It's easy. Todd at blueberry.com, blueberry without the E's, because we didn't have the 2 million to buy the E's. So it's BLUBRRY.com. And just drop me a line and happy to do a call or any type of consultation or just answer questions about the service. That's the easiest way.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me on. Good catching up.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. If you want to learn more about podcast advertising, head on over to my relatively new YouTube channel. You can find me, Heather at Osgood, over on YouTube. Take care, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.